You said something while we were talking about that I think was probably a clue about how you take anything complex, ascertain the principles, and teach it to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of a time recently when you've done that?
Well, to some degree, even when I'm coaching with clients, I'm constantly, because they'll present with this huge chunk of whatever. And as we talk and as I listen and as we meta model our way down to what's really going on kind of stuff, it's representative of it now and what I do now. But I could read any material, whether it's, in this line of stuff or research on anything else, science, astronomy, anything pretty much, and say, oh, okay, it means this, 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 and this. And then I'll have a conversation with somebody and I'll just give them like this distilled version of the essentials of what all this mess was. Well, okay, now I just made a connection. It's you kind of said something. And it goes back again to when I was younger. The reason I was as good as I was and advanced so quickly was I didn't look to learn the technique itself, right? Which a lot of people did and do. They'll say, okay, well, this is the technique. And early on, I had a challenge with that, and that there's no guarantee your opponent's going to feed you the right energy to use it that way. So I had to identify what the principle of the technique was. This way, I could just use it depending on what energy came at me. It might not look exactly identical physically, but the principle of it is the same.
So if I can just jump in there, when you're practicing and you're practicing a certain hold or a certain throw, that's demonstrated, you're practicing that thing and everyone's following the same script. But when you get into a competition, it's not like that. They're going to do anything.
Anything and everything. Yeah. Or on the street, even. It's going to be anything and everything.
If you're trying to read what hold or whatever it is that they're doing, reacting to that, it's too late. So understanding the principle is somehow giving you an advantage in that situation.
Exactly. And it would be not so much, okay, well, this is what I'm doing. And this is, okay, so it goes from here to here and it worked. I had to then say to myself, okay, why? Why did that work? In neurolinguistics, right? You could take, say, a swish pattern and I would learn it. I learned it. And that's nice. Or a fast phobia cure. Okay. It works. It's nice. I've used it for 100 other things other than phobias. Because when I learned it, I then had to say to myself, why does that work? That's what I need to know. And I could adjust the surface level technique to anything as long as I understood what the principle was and why it worked the way it did. For my master's certification, I had to come up with I had to invent a technique.
So what's the connection between learning NLP and learning EFT and learning karate?
I love the feeling, I guess, of mastering something.
Why master those things and not woodworking or cookery or flower
Oh,
arts, those
well,
things?
karate and martial arts was the only sport I was really, really good at. I mean, I was okay at football, but that I just, for some reason, I was a lot of natural ability. So I took to it very quickly. I had what they called fine motor memory. So I really would only have to watch an instructor twice at the most. And I was able to almost absorb it into my muscle firing, and I was just boom, do it off. The other stuff, the mind has always fascinated me. My bachelor's is in psychology. Always like people are like, oh, so you can study how people do, why they do what they do. No, my driver was, why do I do what I do? And
what was it about yourself? Wanted to understand better.
Part of it was what I mentioned earlier about a lot of the fear-based responses to things.
And I think a lot of people get into martial arts, boxing, that kind of thing, initially to learn self-defense. And then beyond that, they learn that it's actually about much, much more.
Well, I had a bit of an anger thing when I was younger. I was able to go to it was Kung Fu, actually. It was the first thing I learned. And I was able to go to the school and hit people and not get in trouble. So I was like, okay, where do I sign for this? This is pretty cool. And there was a TV show on when I was younger. You probably might even remember it, Kung Fu.
Yeah.
With David Carradine.
David Carradine, yeah.
Yes. And I wanted to be him because he was always able to control his state, his emotions, he never freaked out no matter what was going on. And, he kicked butt to keep the peace kind of stuff. And I wanted to be him.
Yeah.
And as it turned out, my martial art journey began. I was able to find the only school in my borough that taught that style.
Would it be fair to say that long before you formally started learning Kung Fu in that class, you were watching David Carradine and copying his moves in your bedroom?
Oh yeah, definitely trying that. I remember even early on, after I started training, Chuck Norris's movies started coming out, and there was one fight sequence in particular that I actually had memorized.
Okay.
But yeah, so it was kind of my shot to maybe not get so bullied anymore, not to maybe get rid of the anger some. And I was very fortunate. I always had instructors who taught the mind game, as well as the physical thing. And one was a little extreme about it, but he would, if I started losing my temper, the match was stopped and he would hit me and, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm fighting. He goes, no, you're not. You're becoming a punk. You're supposed to be a warrior here. This is not how this works. And he would sit me down. He wouldn't let me go on. And I would get even angrier. And he's like, oh, are you angry? Come. And I would have to fight him. And so 3 or 4 times of that, I was cured. I was done. I didn't want to get my, I would get beat so bad I couldn't even get my hands over to get my shirt off afterwards. It's just like, okay, you proved your point. I'm not doing that anymore. It's like shock therapy kind of, but it's always about, even with the EFT and all this stuff, to try and to be candid, I guess, is to try and get past the inner, sometimes, most of the time it's pretty low, but that inner dialogue of not so thrilled with myself. Mm-hmm. So there's that constant fight and that constant push to say, okay, when I get here, and I get to this, and I master this, you know, and I could do this, this, and this, then maybe.
I would imagine that, I know that you do work in schools, and you work with the kids in the schools who are maybe having a bit of difficulty with the educational system. And I can imagine that maybe in some of them you kind of see your younger self, and that it's,
And a lot of them,
and it's perhaps a almost a healing experience for you when you're able to support them through that, and to help them.
Yeah, a lot of them. And I hated school. I hated high school, and I work in one. So I could understand where a lot of them come from. And yeah, a lot of the work is healing to myself. I actually had the opportunity to work with a kid who actually bullied me in middle school.
Wow.
And he, you know, he's my age, and he called and said, "You want to work? Could I work with you?" And I felt like, you know, I'm all right, fine. You know, it's whatever. And what do you want to work on? And he goes, "Well, you know, I used to treat people pretty bad." I said, "Well, you treated me pretty bad. You know, I might as well say this up front before we even get started. You know, I don't like you very much, you know, but I'm going to help you. But I'm not a fan." And he goes, "Well, that's what I want to work on. The guilt of what I did to people like you when I was younger."
Wow.
So by the time we were done, we came full circle. And I probably healed as much as he did from that. But that always, that kind of stuff is why I do that material with the NLP and the EFT and the hypnosis and all that.
So it sounds like what you described with the sort of the ability to learn, watching the instructors, it sounded like you had spent many years practicing that in front of the TV. So you'd practice that ability to connect the visual with the motor control, and as you say, memorized Chuck Norris.
Right. Yeah, I guess so.
So you'd practiced that already. So that made you, that put you in a position where you were able to learn that much more easily and master that much more easily than something like football, where it isn't so much about just watch the way this guy carries the ball and then you carry the ball like that. It's not the same kind of sport.
No. And there's a lot more components to football. Well, when I say football, I'm using your football, our soccer, your football. Yeah. You're one of the few people I could actually use a real term with. So I was taking advantage of the opportunity.
Either one involves a bunch of guys running around.
But you know, there's a lot of things that are going on at once in soccer / football. So just you know, it was just it was much for me, I guess. I never had quite the ball control. Even though I was a defender most of the time, I still didn't have a whole lot of ball control with it. But
it seems with the Kung Fu and the Karate, there's more a specific move that you're watching, a specific hold, there's a specific fall or whatever it is that you're emulating in order to get it right, in order to be able to get through that class.
Yes, and the main thing, actually, as you said that, something clicked in my head. One of the main reasons I liked those karate, kung fu, stuff like that, as opposed to a soccer, was, and I did run track also and all that stuff. But even with track, I was in relays and all that. I never liked being on a team. Because I always felt either A, I was going to let the team down, or B, they were going to let me down. And my success or failure a lot of times relied upon someone else. In karate, it was just me. There was no one in front of that opponent but me. I had no one to blame but me. I had no one to rely on but me.
Yeah.
And I liked that.
And that process of mastery is very different in an individual activity like that.
Mm-hmm.
So coming back to the thing about understanding the principles and being able, you see, the phrase that you used when we were talking about the weight loss was, you said things started to congeal in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like at that moment I was getting a glimpse of this mastering of the principles skill that we're talking about.
Yeah, could have been.
There's all these different elements that are starting to come together in some way, and you're synthesizing something new from that you're then able to, as you said, teach somebody else, the taking all of that complexity and potentially conflicting information.
That describes the strategy that I've come to understand a little bit, that I've come to understand pretty well, because it gets to a point where I could initially be struggling to put stuff in place, but once I finally get to that point, then I'm like, got it. I see it, and I can understand it, what's going on, and then I could just, oh, by the way, this is why this is going on. This is why this works. This is why it's not working, which in education is mostly why it's not working. But I could get to that point once everything is in place.
So it sounds like one of the things that you're doing there is resolving conflicting information. That if you've got,
I could say that,
2 or 10 people say, oh, I know you should do it like this. No, you should do it like this. No, like this, no, like this. And you're trying to figure out, yeah, but there's something about being able to discard the differences that are irrelevant and being able, as you put it, congeal, to allow to come together the elements which are similar or support each other. And from that, understand that must be the essential principle of it.
mm-hmm.
That if you ask, 100 people how to boil an egg or cook pasta or whatever, they'll give you 100 different ways of doing it. But actually within that, there will be something, some essence.
Something that is a common thread. Mm-hmm. That runs
I
through all.
wonder if that's what you're doing, is if you're stripping out, or essentially stripping out the different personalities and subjective experiences and ending up with something that is some objective essence of that skill, that activity.
Yeah, I mean, unconsciously, I could be modeling unconsciously, because that's kind of what it is. You take what you see as initial strategies and you start pairing off the stuff that won't really matter until you get to the essence of what the strategy is.
Yes. So I'm imagining, going back to your learning Kung Fu and karate days, I'm imagining you watching a demonstration thinking, he did that and that was what won. And then you'd watch another, oh no, he did something different and it was still effective. No, he did a different thing again and it was still effective. So what is it that's really effective? And so you're sorting out the differences, and what you're ending up with is the simplest form of what you need to do in order to be effective, I guess, in that situation. Does that seem to describe?
I like how you put that, because that resonates with me, the simplest form. And I think it's because even in my progression through the different martial arts that I studied, they went from, not to insult any kind of martial artist here, but in my view, from some of the most complex, and it just kept paring itself down to where I was with Wing Chun and then eventually Filipino arts, which are they're much simpler systems. They're much less complex in terms of number of technique and forms and stuff like that. Some Kung Fu styles have 10, 20 forms. Wing Chun as a Kung Fu form only has 3. Filipino arts don't really have any. They don't even teach stances. It's based on principles of weight distribution and footwork and how things move and how things flow. And
so, sorry, it sounds like the different forms, as you put it. It sounds like almost like they're recipes. if a person comes at you like this, you do this. If a person comes at you like this, you do this. And it's a complex sort of decision-making system. Whereas what you're describing, principles of distribution of weight, it's not about if this happens, then respond this way. It's understand the dynamics of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more about, I wonder if that's more about predicting than it is about reacting, and therefore you're in more control, or you feel like you're in more control when you're understanding those simple principles.
Probably a combination of both. I think at a certain level with certain things, you are in a predicting mode where when I first started really understanding NLP, for example, after my practitioner level training, for a while, the world was like the Matrix to me. You know, everybody and everything was pretty predictable based on what they were saying. You know, I could just see the lines coming down the green screen. You know, it's like, oh, you're going to say this next, and I will pretend to act surprised. And for a little bit, it kind of took the color out of the world for me because everything was so predictable. And people were just like, oh, you're running that program. Okay, well, here's what you're going to do next. And boom. Then eventually, I was able to step away from the predictable kind of model and more towards, okay, this is how I'm going to now respond. And give the world its color back. You know, maybe I'm not going to predict as much. Maybe I will let myself be surprised. Maybe it will, you know, that kind of thing. And so that kind of shift took place. Because there again, same thing. Why is this all working? Because this is, I mean, I have the Shlomo Vatkin's book, the 350 techniques of NLP. Things like a phone book. You know, let's just sit there and memorize that. But what I will do on occasion is get it and pick like 5 different techniques and say, okay, what's common to all of that? Why do they work? Mm-hmm. You know, and then, oh, okay, well, maybe I could do this or that way. You know, when Bandler says it's a philosophy that just happens to leave techniques behind, you know, that was resonating to me because I'm a principles guy. Show me the principles of what's happening.
Right. So what I've seen a lot of students do, and I'm sure you've seen the same, is they get very hung up on being able to do the technique right and get very confused when they see a different way of doing the same technique. They say, oh, no, when I learned Swish or Fast Phobia Cure, that's not how we did it. And mm-hmm. I don't understand how you know, it's different. And, you know, it's like seeing 2 recipes for meatballs and being confused because one has basil in it and the other one doesn't, and being confused by the differences. But it seems that what you're doing is, rather than being confused by those contradictions, you're finding a way to integrate them by saying, well, essentially by saying, if these two things are presented in the same way and they get the same result, then that difference must be irrelevant.
That'd be fair.
So does that mean then, in order for you, if you were to read 3 different descriptions of, say, a fast phobia cure, and they were different, that in order for you to be able to know that the differences are irrelevant, would you have to try each of them out? Or do you just sort of mentally walk through it? Or do you not even?
I would mentally walk through them.
Okay.
I would definitely, yeah, because like I usually
mentally walking through the Kung Fu routine and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, because I did a lot of mental practice. Mm-hmm. You know, especially when after 2 or 3 hours, body's about had it. So I just would continue, you know, or maybe it was a non-practice day and I was just reading through some martial art books and looking at the pictures, and I was able to make those still pictures into movies in my head so I could see the continuity and the flow. And actually, you know, as much as people would say, you know, you can't learn from a book because it's static. I always found that an advantage because it forced me to fill in the blank in my head. Okay, he's here like this, now he's like this, and I'm like, okay, well, how did that happen? How did he get there? Because there's no picture. Yeah. So I had to fill the blank in of how would you reasonably go from that position to that position.
So if you're reading a description of 3 different techniques, mm-hmm. and you're mentally walking that through, creating a movie in your mind, mm-hmm. and you're observing that there are differences, and yet you can see how they all end up in approximately the same place. Mm-hmm. And therefore the differences between them, let's say one of them says you're in a cinema, movie theater, and another one says you're watching the TV, and another one says whatever, then that tells you, well, whether it's a cinema or TV must be irrelevant.
Exactly.
That can't be the thing that's making the technique work.
Exactly, because
when you see all 3 of them say, you imagine getting up and seeing yourself, and you go and sit across the other side, and they all say that, then you think, okay, that must be important because it's in all of them.
I actually go even a step further, as I'll ask myself, why is that important? Mm-hmm. So because as you talk about, I'm remembering when I was looking at a couple of different ways to do the fast phobia cure, other than the one I learned. Mm. One used, imagine plexiglass.
Okay.
And one was something else. And I remember saying, well, that doesn't matter. And the fact that you're looking at yourself, why does that's in all of them. Why does that matter? And obviously it's the dissociation that matters.
That matters, would you imagine not doing that step and compare the difference?
I would say that's what probably happens, though I'm not aware. To me, it's almost of an instinctive, that doesn't matter, that does, I need to know why. I don't know how I get there. It's probably some kind of deeper level contrasting that you're describing. And a quick run through in my head saying, okay, if I ran through all these, that's all there, and all 3 of them for some reason, and if I did it without it, that's not going to work. So I need to know that why.
So skipping forward to the point where you're going to teach this simplified model or process to somebody else, mm-hmm. what you've done is you've stripped out the confusion. And if you've got somebody who isn't coming to you and saying, I've heard about these things called meatballs, can you teach me how to make meatballs? I'm guessing they're probably coming to you in a state of confusion, mm-hmm. having been told 3 different ways of doing something, and unable, because of lack of experience or because their mind doesn't work that way or whatever, but are unable to rationalize those differences. And that's the role that you're playing, mm-hmm. in that simplifying, that congealing, that creating that principle.
And it walks backwards in a way, because as you were talking right now, I could hear a little conversation as your client is coming in saying that. My first question would always be, what is the target? What's your outcome? Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Once they tell me that, then, okay, well, this is the principle that leads towards that outcome, whatever that might be. You could be using fast phobia for being depressed. I've actually done that. Mm-hmm. And actually worked really well, because why the fast phobia code works really is the same regardless. You're disassociating, you're scrambling, you're scratching the record, so to speak, so it's not processed or wired the same way, putting them back in, look at that, oh yeah, no big deal. You can really do that with anything, but people get hung up on this, oh, it's only for phobias.
Yes.
Because that's what the technique is. It's for a phobia. No, it's for an internal process.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the why.
Phobia in a demonstration is a nice parlor trick because it looks very impressive.
Right, because phobias have this massive shift that you can see.
Right.
Right.
And what the audience doesn't see is how long that shift lasts.
That is true.
Very impressive for 5 minutes.
There are times, and there's a little bit of reconditioning that needs to happen. And I do tell people most of the work, even with EFT, there was always this challenge, partially because of the way it was promoted early on. As much as Gary Craig would say, it's not a 1 minute wonder thing, yet that would be always the kind of cases he would highlight.
Yeah.
It's just bam.
It sounds great, doesn't it? This idea of fast, painless, effortless change. It's
exactly
what everybody wants, because you want to go to the doctor and say, I want you to pull this thorn out, but don't hurt me while you're doing it.
Exactly. And after a while, I realized that they do happen, but it's extremely rare, as if you hit the core aspect right on the first shot. And it's a simple, maybe 1 or 2 core aspect kind of deal, and you could collapse the whole works. But usually, no. And what I tell people is you have to look at your mind like a piano. And you just got this brand new piano, and you're going to have a guy come over, and he's going to tune it. And he's going to tell you he's going to be back next week. And you're thinking, well, didn't you just tune it up? Right? I fast phobia cured. Aren't we done? No, because the strings have been conditioned to a certain length. We have to recondition them to stay in tune. And that occurs over time.
That sounds like an example of exactly the process that we're talking about. Your ability to describe this aspect of the process of change using the metaphor of the piano tuning, which I absolutely understand. But in order for you to create that metaphor, you must have understood something about the essence of the process of change.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an example of a way in which you might teach the principles. So we've talked about principles of change. Now you've taught me how to understand why we need that period of acclimatization, or however you want to describe it, using the metaphor of the piano tuner. And you're able to get to that because you've, in your desire to learn, you're getting information from all of these different sources, from trainings, from books, from videos, from talking to people. And a lot of that information is contradictory. So you are personally, you're imagining yourself in that. You're trying that on, just like you tried on the Chuck Norris's Kung Fu moves. You're walking through that. And when you reach a point where there's a contradiction between 2 different methods, you stop and walk through them and compare them and figure out, well, if they're different, are they actually irrelevant? Can I cast those out? Can I simplify it from there? Not have to bother with those steps. And what I end up is with something simple. And you've been able in this conversation to express that in very literal terms about the process of change. And then without me asking you to, you also expressed it as a metaphor. So you ran the whole program just in the last couple of minutes.
Would seem like.
And you said that at the start of the conversation, when you said, oh, it's not what I thought we were going to talk about, and what you wanted to talk about was how you do this. And that's an example of you doing this kind of embedded within itself, wanting to understand how you do this process of learning and simplifying and teaching so that you can master it even more, I guess.
Yeah. And maybe transmit it as a teaching to some folks.
Yes, to become even more effective in doing that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any insights that you've gained from this conversation that you think will help you to do that?
Oh yeah. I think it's kind of created where I can see what I'm doing. You've helped me make those connections. Like, I never thought of the compare and contrast stuff was going on and all that. I didn't think of that. But as you described these things more and more, everything was starting to click together for me. Like, wow, yeah, that feels right. That's what's going on. That's exactly what's going on. So first of all, I thank you very much for doing this with me, because that's been something I've been wanting to get a key of for a whole long time. And it's, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to be kind of contained here, but I'm actually probably going to, when I sign off, go like Nature Boy, woo, you know, because it was literally like enlightening for me.
Wow.
I really do appreciate it.
No, I very much appreciate you taking the time and being so open and willing to explore this, because, you know, we are digging into the psyche and the, you know, the life experience, and I find it interesting how the things that drive us to do to achieve things or to do things that are remarkable, often we don't feel so good about, but that's to put a judgment on it. It was a situation in life that caused certain things, that predisposed you to working in certain ways, to learning certain things, that made it easier to learn certain other things as you got older. And when you're learning, I think something like NLP or personal change techniques or martial arts, you know, as you've said there are so many different schools, so many different styles. Well, if you're going to get hung up on who's right, you'll never use it. You'll never act. Mm-hmm. And the key question you asked, you said you asked of your clients, was what is your target? So if what you got in mind is, well, what is my objective in learning all of these different things, whatever it, martial arts or change techniques or whatever, and you've got that in mind, that's an incentive to simplify, because you're trying to get back to that target with the least, not the least effort, but the
most direct method. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's not about effort. I think human beings are naturally energy efficient. I think we naturally create shortcuts. That's not just, and there's no sort of connotation of anything like laziness in there. It's more about its efficiency, elegance. Mm-hmm. Actually, is the thing that I've always admired, is elegance.
Yes. That's the word I definitely would use.
I think, you know, whatever it is, how somebody boils an egg, how a dancer moves, actors that we see in movies, you know, there are certain scenes in movies that there's just a fleeting glance, and I just think that is elegant. That's amazing how that person has conveyed so much in such a minimalistic way, and that's something that fascinates me. So mm-hmm. That's why I love doing this and modeling, because the stuff I learn from people is just breathtaking, really. So I'm very, very grateful for your willingness and your openness in this.
Oh, my pleasure. I got a lot out of it, my friend. I really did. I do appreciate it. I'm sitting, but it's not easy, because it's just like this enlightenment kind of moment when I'm going to say this, hope I don't embarrass you, but I could count on one hand the amount of times I can remember, for whether it was in the martial arts or in these change kind of things, where I felt that I was in the presence of an actual master. And it's rare. I've had it only twice in my entire martial art career. I've only had it twice in this kind of field up until today.
Wow. Thank
you. It's that same kind of feeling of, wow, this was cool. I was in the presence of a master, and I'm going to take this conversation and I'm going to probably be thinking on it for a few days to get as much as I can out of it, because these are rare opportunities in my life.